This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, ready to go.
All right. I wish I could figure it out.
You can figure it out.
All right. This is the story of 4 revolutions, starting with the American Revolution, which you know most of the facts about, but maybe not all. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the German Revolution. And this quote at the bottom is something that I've read that I thought was interesting. In revolutions, the meanest sons of bitches usually win. Well, shucks. Here we go. Just a little bit of context information. Here's what a revolution is. Fundamental, relatively sudden change that occurs when the population revolts against the government. Aristotle said there were 2 types of political revolutions. One is a complete change from one constitution from another, or a different one is just major modifications to an existing constitution. And the word constitution in that case is a small c, may have a different basis, but that's what it means. Revolutions have been occurring throughout human history. They go all the way back to recorded history, really. They vary widely in method, duration, and ideology. They usually result in major changes in culture, economy, and socio-political institutions. I'm going to talk primarily about all 4 of them using those criteria. Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted. I'm sorry, I muted everybody else.
The last point that I make is are there lessons for us in these revolutions to consider as we assess the protests and riots that we are facing today? And a very simple question is, when does a protest become a riot? Here are the 4 revolutions. Here's their durations. Who was their previous regime? What were the proximate causes? What changed culturally? And in the United States, almost nothing changed culturally. It certainly did in France, it did in Russia, and it did in Germany. What institutionally changed? What were the near-term outcomes? And in the United States, it was we decided to explore widening our boundaries to the West Coast. The French generated Napoleon Bonaparte. The Russians generated Soviet authoritarianism. And the German Revolution generated World War II. And then you see down at the bottom what the long-term outcomes were. There have been hundreds of revolutions in the last 250 years. Everything from Franco's revolution to the Confederate Revolution, although most people don't use that word, the Mexican War of Independence, and many more. Most countries have multiple revolutions in their history. The United States is among the most stable with only 1 in 250 years. But however, none of them were as significant as the 4 I'm going to talk about and the one that Jerry covered last week in China. With the protests, the violence, and splits in our country today, the subject of what these revolutions included seemed to me to be a good idea to explore. And I learned a lot doing the research, like I always do. With the exception of the American Revolution, and that was back in the 18th century, the other revolutions outlined in the analysis have led to authoritarian systems. That's the normal outcome of a revolution. And as we face choices in the near future, and we definitely are staring some pretty serious choices in this day and age, we need to consider the consequences of the choices, especially what I call the unintended consequences. Now, the American Revolution. As you know, America was settled as a colony of Great Britain. Remember that now, not a colony of anybody else. Its white inhabitants were almost all English immigrants or their descendants. In 1775, there were only 2.75 million people living in the colonies. Then in the early 18th century, a number of taxes were enacted by the British Parliament on the trade of American goods. And these caused resentments, especially in New England, leading to smuggling, bribery, but not revolution. It's said that the American Revolution really was caused by the Anglo-French conflict in the New World, known as the French and Indian War. It is said by some people that's what precipitated us to revolt. To pay for this war and to house 10,000 troops in America, Parliament passed first the Stamp Act, which imposed.
Hey, George, can I just say a quick, when you say it was caused by the French-American War, that was because of the cost, right? They were trying to impose those taxes to pay for the war?
Right, absolutely. They imposed direct taxes on the colonies for the first time after the war. Almost immediately, a political slogan, and you know how good slogans are, no taxation without representation, was the slogan that summarized the grievances of the American colonists. Many believed that because they weren't represented in Parliament, any laws that it passed were illegal under something called the Bill of Rights of 1869. And the Bill of Rights is something that was enacted in England and basically granted all Englishmen the right to be personally represented in Parliament. That did not ring true for people in the colony. So they said that was the basis. These Bill of Rights was the basis for their resentment. What happened in after 1765, after the war ended, was protests in the streets, particularly in two governments, Virginia and Massachusetts. The Boston Tea Party was the earliest documented protest, but it followed the Boston Massacre, where a crowd threw rocks and debris at British soldiers, and the soldiers fired into the crowd and killed 5 colonists. The Sons of Liberty, I did not know this, was a revolutionary organization founded by Samuel Adams in Boston. It was founded to protect the rights of colonists and to fight taxation. It spread. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which placed duties on staple goods. And tea. That then precipitated the Boston Tea Party. It only lasted 1 year, and Parliament realized it was a bad idea. What happened next was Samuel Adams. I'm going to talk about Adams. I thought he would be a good person to use as my illustration. He created something called a Committee of Correspondence. It was a network linking patriots in the 13 colonies, and it was eventually to provide the framework for the rebel government. Virginia followed soon after. What the British government did, and if you read about what was going on in England, they were saying, you know, the colonists need to be taught a lesson, and they responded with something called the Intolerable Acts, one of which was the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act said British troops would be lodged in colonists' homes to save money. In 1774, the first Continental Congress convened. This Continental Congress came from this Committee of Correspondence. Representatives from each colony attended this Congress. Immediately, the British declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion. The British garrison was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders. Lexington and Concord soon followed. I'm going to go through the revolution very, very quickly. The war. War started immediately with the Battle of Breed's Hill, not the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill was next to it, and how it got its name in, I don't know. But then Washington captured Boston. It was going to be a war that Washington fought not to lose. He never intended to win the war. Now that's what I've heard. Sounds good. That same year, Benedict Arnold led a campaign to conquer Canada. The decision was, while we're at it, let's get the Canadians to participate. It failed. Later that year, Washington was defeated at Brooklyn, and New York City fell and was never recaptured. In 1777, Washington defeated the British at Trenton, and Burgoyne surrendered to Gates at Saratoga. And this is where Arnold lost it, because Arnold was really the one that was responsible for Saratoga, but Gates was the general in charge and got the credit. In 1778, while the army was in Valley Forge, the United States signed the French alliance. And from my perspective, that's when we won the revolution. The French were still mad at the British. They were still fighting the British. And once we had them on our side, we had their navy, and eventually we had French troops fighting with us. Had they not participated with us, I think that the revolution would have failed. Through 79 and 80, fighting continued but was inconclusive. But as I said very early about Washington, the colonial army remained intact. They then formed another treaty with Spain. So now the Brits were not just fighting the colonies, they were fighting both colonies, France, and Spain. In 1781, the Articles of Confederation were adopted by the Continental Congress. That's going to come back to haunt. That same year, French forces began arriving in sizable numbers. Following battles in South Carolina, Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown and surrendered, and the world turned upside down, according to the Brits. In 1783, a peace treaty was signed. Now, the Continental Congress functioned as a national government at the outset of the war. It was responsible for raising armies, setting strategy, appointing diplomats to other countries, etc. Notice I don't have on there it was responsible for raising money, and that was an ongoing problem with the Continental Congress. They were borrowing most of what they used from other countries. All 13 colonies were represented. The Congress agreed to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It explained why the colonies were at war with the Kingdom of Great Britain, regarded us as 13 independent sovereign states, no longer under British rule. Following the end of hostilities, the collective states functioned erratically under those Articles of Confederation and had severe problems, economic problems, poor decision making. Nobody was really in charge. It had no executive branch to speak of, and the government floundered. In 1786, a convention was held to revise, and that's what they said at the time. All they wanted to do was revise the Articles of Confederation. Led by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, a new document was developed, the U.S. Constitution. This document, including 27 amendments, the first 10 of the Bill of Rights that were written at that time, in the ensuing 230 years, has been the foundation of the United States of America. And with the exception of the Civil War, where this was pretty severely challenged, that has held us together for 230 years. Now, I want to go on to the French Revolution, which is different. But first, I want to talk about Samuel Adams. He was an American statesman, and he was one of the founding fathers. He was the architect of something called the Principles of American Republicanism that shaped the political culture. He was second cousin to John Adams. He was a graduate of Harvard. He was an unsuccessful businessman, but he was one of the leaders opposed to Parliament's efforts to tax the colonies without consent. In 1768, he wrote a circular letter calling for non-cooperation. That's what prompted the occupation by the British soldiers and eventually resulted in the Boston Massacre. They devised this Committee of Correspondence in 1772, which linked like-minded patriots throughout the colonies and led to the Boston Tea Party. He led the Continental Congress to the Declaration of Independence. He is not the writer of it, but he is certainly one of the people who was very strongly supportive of writing such a declaration. He returned to Massachusetts after the Revolution. He was eventually elected as governor. I'm going to talk a little bit when I talk about rebellions and riots and whatnot, about the Shay's rebellion. His idea, now that's the first American riot within its own country, was the Shay's rebellion. He wanted to execute all of its leaders. He played hardball once he was in charge. He died at the age of 81.
Hey, George.
Hey.
Was it, excuse me for interrupting, was John, who defended successfully the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre? Was it John Adams?
John Adams.
Yeah, which was a little ironic because he kind of started, the ball rolling towards that and yet turned around and defended those soldiers who were involved. Okay, excuse me.
His premise was that we were a country of law and that the law supported what the soldiers did to protect themselves. Okay, the French Revolution, a little different. It was a social and political upheaval, and you'll notice the years up here, 1789, 1799. It only lasted 10 years. The American Revolution set the stage for the French Revolution. It showed them that a revolt based on natural rights and equality against an authoritarian regime would succeed. It overthrew the king and established a republic. Turmoil followed, and it led to Napoleon. Following the American Revolution, now remember, they had been at war with England for years, even before our revolution. France was bankrupt. And what they did around 1788 was suspended payment of debts. And then they enacted something called a regressive tax. And I had to look up what a regressive tax was. What it says was whatever the percentage of the tax, everybody's going to get the same tax. So if you're wealthy, you pay 5%. If you're poor, you pay 5%. It was not popular with the poor. They also had years of bad harvest. They had freezing temperatures. They had resentment of the privileges that were enjoyed by the aristocracy. You've heard, let them eat cake, and the Catholic clergy. Rioting started in April of 1889 with protest marches. What they did at the time, they did not immediately go to overthrowing the king. They demanded the king address shortages in food, unemployment, and low wages. So what King Louis XVI did was he convened something called the Estates General. And that's their equivalent of Parliament. Had not been in force for 100 years to address the situation. The National Assembly met. They immediately decided that what they needed was a new constitution. So the king invalidated the decisions of the National Assembly. On July the 14th of 89, an armed crowd besieged the Bastille. You've heard of storming the Bastille. Several hours of resistance, the fortress surrendered, and as he exited, he was killed. A month later, the Assembly adopted something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. 2 years of this went on, so for 2 years, 89 to 91, the assembly was in control, and then the royal family decided to flee the country. They were immediately arrested and put under house arrest. In 1792, the assembly formed something called a Revolutionary Tribunal. And then there was a civil war, and I did not look up the details of it, but it was between the royalists and the assembly. Louis XVI, who had been in house arrest, was arrested and put in prison. 1793, he was tried for treason and guillotined. That became their capital punishment of choice. Soon Marie Antoinette was also guillotined, and that was just the beginning. That same year, something called the Committee on Public Safety took control, and something called the Reign of Terror began. The following year, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Robespierre because I doubt if you know a lot about him. He rose and fell. 16,000 people were executed by the Committee on Public Safety. Meanwhile, France was conducting wars in many arenas. Her armies flourished. Napoleon led successful campaigns throughout these revolutionary wars, came back to France and said, okay, it's time to straighten things out. So in 1804, he became emperor, and for all intents and purposes, the revolution was over. Maximilien Robespierre, nice guy. He was a lawyer. He was one of the best known and most influential figures in the revolution. He was a member of the Constituent Assembly and also something called the Jacobin Club. He was in favor of the rights of man kinds of ideals, universal suffrage, at least for men, and other ideals of the Enlightenment. He played a critical role in the fall of the monarchy and the summoning of the National Convention. His goal was to create a united, indivisible France, equality before the law, abolishing royal prerogatives, defending the principles of direct democracy. So this is what his idealistic view was in 1792. He was also one of the members of something called the Insurrectionary Paris Commune. He was elected to the convention, and he was criticized because he immediately wanted to go to a dictatorship, or at the very least, something called a triumvirate. And I could spend a lot of time. I don't know that much about leadership, but for the first few years, a man named Danton was one of the primary leaders, another one named Marat. So it wasn't that Robespierre at the beginning was as much in charge as things changed. Marat was murdered, Danton was executed. In 73, whoops, and that's 93, he was appointed a member of the Committee of Public Safety, and he reorganized the Revolutionary Tribunal. The Reign of Terror follows. Thousands of people were designated, arrested, and guillotined. And if you haven't read A Tale of Two Cities, that's what that's about. It's about the Reign of Terror and what was being done to French aristocrats during that time. It only lasted a year when he and 50 of his allies were arrested on a date called 9 Thermidor. They had their own whatever you want to call it. He was wounded in the arrest, badly wounded. You can see here he's in terrible shape. However, he was tried and guillotined. Thus ended Maximilien Robespierre. They ate their children, putting it mildly. Now I'm going to talk about the Russian Revolution. In 1896, Nicholas II became the Tsar of all the Russias. There had been his family in power for 350 years when he was Tsar. In 1905, something called Bloody Sunday took place. It was a protest. Military forces fired into the crowds. It was called the Revolution of 1905. What the Tsar did, this is Nicholas, he promised them civil liberties and an elected parliament. So he responded to this first revolution by giving them a parliament. The next year, the parliament created a constitution, which reflected all of the promises that he had made the previous year. They formed something that they called a Council of Ministers. This Council of Ministers decided policy, tactical direction, served as a buffer between the emperor and the national legislature. And this lasted for about 9 years. And then in 1914, World War I began when Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. And if you all remember some previous talks, they declared war on Austria because war was declared on Serbia by Austria, and Russia had a pact with Serbia to protect them. So now, pretty much of a backwards country was in a world war. The war was devastating to the Russian economy, and if you want to read some things about Russia in the First World War, the Germans just thrashed the Russians. They were outnumbered by the Russians, but they were far more effective military machine. The war devastated the Russian economy. It created instability in the population in Russia. Now we're into the middle 1915, 1916. In February of 1917, strikes and demonstrations and mutinies. That's when the Russian Navy mutinied, and that engulfed Petrograd. And much of what happened during the revolution really revolved around what was going on in Petrograd. Most of the population was more or less passive compared to what all the politics were in the capital. The next month, the Tsar abdicated. He said, I can't handle this situation. I quit. His brother would not accept the position of Tsar, so there was no Tsar in 1917. So then what they did was they formed a provisional government. A prince named Lvov replaced the Council of Ministers of Russia with this provisional government. Now, this is early 1917. You got to keep track of the time because things started happening very, very quickly in Russia. The revolt, and I want to go back now to something that happened back in 1905 because I did not know this. Starting in 1905, back to the 1905 revolt, Soviet councils of workers were established. They were informal agencies, but they were responsible for strikes, workers' demands, and petitions for rights. And these councils of workers became really the heart of the communist movement. In April of 1917, and you may have heard of Lenin's return from exile, he arrived in Petrograd by a sealed train. The Germans, at the time, Lenin was in Switzerland, and they decided that what they wanted to do was get Lenin back to Russia, where he would destabilize the Russian effort to fight the Germans. And they wanted to get away from a two-front war. Lenin immediately resumed power in the Bolshevik Party, which he had founded in 1902. His focus, and this is really critical, his focus was expanding Bolshevik cells within the Soviets of workers. He realized that the Soviet councils of workers were a method through which his revolution could be successful. In July of 17, there were widespread protests against the provisional government. That's the one with Lvov in charge. Meanwhile, this government continued the war against the Germans. The Tsar was gone, but now this government was running the war. The Bolsheviks tried to direct these protests into a coup. It failed, and Lenin had to go into hiding in July of 1917. Later that month, and I'm going to tell you about this guy for a couple of different reasons, Alexander Karinsky became prime minister of this provisional government. So the provisional government has just undergone a coup and survived. In August, another coup was initiated by a general named Kornilov, who was the supreme commander of the Russian army. It also failed. So they went through, in 1917, one hell of a sequence of events. It failed primarily because of the Bolsheviks' influence over these Soviets back here. That's what kept Kornilov from a military coup of Russia. In October of 17, just 2 months later, there was another revolt, and this time the Bolsheviks took over Petrograd. The first thing the Bolsheviks did was disband the provisional government. All of this happened in the space of little more than 6 months. They were just constant turmoil. I want to tell you about Karinsky. He was born in 81, died in 1970. He was a lawyer and a revolutionary. He was a key figure in the revolt of 1917. His father taught Lenin when Lenin was a boy. And members of his family and the Ulyanov family were friends. So he knew Lenin personally. He became known widely in 1912 when he visited some gold fields. He published material about a minefield massacre, something that the Tsar did. It was a strike and hundreds of people were killed. He was the person who blew the whistle on what the Tsar's forces did. At the opening of the Duma in 1916, he called the imperial ministers hired assassins and cowards, and he said that they were guided by Rasputin and others. So he was a rabble rouser well before the revolution actually took place. After the revolution in 1917, he joined the Russian Provisional Government, Minister of Justice, then Minister of War, and then after July, the second minister chairman of this revolutionary Russian Provisional Government. He was the leader of the moderate socialist faction of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. He was also vice chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. In November, his government was overthrown by the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. He spent the remainder of his life in exile, first to Paris, then to New York City, and then eventually he taught at Stanford. And one of my professors at the military, actually we call them, I forget what we call the P's at West Point. You ought to know, Fred, what do we call them? Anyway, he taught Russian history at West Point. He taught me, and he had been taught by Karinsky. And he said,
I should know that, but I don't.
oh, for God's sakes.
Because I
Anyway.
took Russian history.
He was taught by Karinsky at Stanford. And he said by then, and this guy wasn't any older than I was, hardly. He had a PhD at 19, I think, my teacher at the military academy. He said that Karinsky by then was an old, very, very resentful, angry old man. All he could do was talk about how the Bolsheviks did this and the Bolsheviks did that. And if he had done this, everything would have been fine and yada, yada. So anyway, that's Alexander Karinsky. He was a very well-known figure in the revolution. The Russian Revolution precipitated the Russian Civil War. In March of 18, the new Bolshevik government surrendered to the Germans. at a place called Brest-Litovsk, and they basically gave away the store. Lenin said, all I want to do is quit fighting and consolidate power within my country. The Russian army was demoralized by all of this, but it was still intact. The Russian army was soon facing a Red Army that supported the Bolsheviks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Russian Civil War, but I will be the first to admit that I don't begin to understand the details. Many factions vied to determine what was going to happen to Russia, including forces from America. There were American troops sent to Vladivostok. There were American troops sent to Archangel. They had different functions, but their intent was to take care of American policies or people or money or whatever in Russia while all this was going on. The White Army, that's the dregs of the Russian army, favored a return to monarchism. They favored capitalism and social democracy. The Red Army, which was led primarily by Trotsky and Stalin, were the operative forces of the Bolsheviks. 13 different foreign nations intervened against the Red Army. And the major intervention was actually done by the Germans. And I cannot fully explain. I mean, 500,000 German troops were involved in the beginning of the Civil War. But initially, the Allied forces were trying to reestablish the Eastern Front. They were trying to get the Russians back into the First World War. That was their goal. The Red Army, and I questioned these numbers, but it was the best I could find, at its peak had 5 million men. The White Army, which had 10 different armies, it even had the structures of the old Imperial Army. It had somewhere around 2.5 million men, but they were never coordinated with each other. They were almost acting completely independent of each other. During the fighting, which was dispersed all over the country, the fighting was out at the perimeter, all right? It was not so much in the heartland of Russia as it was out at the perimeter. During the fighting in the Civil War, the Red Army suffered 1,500,000 casualties. The White Army suffered approximately 2 million casualties, and there were 7 to 10 million civilian casualties. I mean, they were destroying Russia during this Civil War. The Bolsheviks defeated their adversaries piecemeal. As hostilities ceased, the whole economy had ground to a standstill. The repercussions in different areas were vicious. Now, I'm not going to tell you about Stalin and Lenin. I know you know all about them. I'm going to tell you about Leon Trotsky. He was a revolutionary. Ideologically, he was a communist. He developed a variant of Marxism known as Trotskyism. He and Lenin were probably the two most, I'll call them, theorists of the Russian Revolution. He joined the Bolshevik Party only a few weeks before the October Revolution in 1917, but he immediately became one of the leaders of the party. He held the post of Commissar for Foreign Affairs. He was involved in the treaty negotiations with Germany. He became prominent from March of 18 to January of 25 as the leader of the Red Army in his post as Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. He was a leading figure in the Red victory in the Russian Civil War, much more so than Stalin was. Trotsky was Lenin's right-hand man early in the process. He was one of the 7 members of the first Politburo. Stalin was also one of them, and then Stalin started to undo the system. After the rise of Stalin, Trotsky was removed from his positions. He was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. He spent the rest of his short life in exile. He was assassinated in 1940 by an NKVD agent in Mexico, of all places. And nobody thinks that Stalin didn't have him executed. He was critical of Stalinism, and so while Stalin was in charge, he was written out of the history books. That's a good way to treat somebody. Okay, let's talk about the German Revolution. Don't go to sleep on it. Germany became a republic in November of 1918 when Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated the throne. They then convened something called a National Assembly in Weimar, and they adopted a new constitution. In 14 years, the Weimar Republic faced incredible problems: hyperinflation, extremism, contentious relationships with the victors of the First World War, for a few. It failed to meet its reparation requirements. It had to pay 50 billion marks a year to the French and the British and the Belgians and the Americans. So when it failed to meet its reparation requirements, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr. They took control of mining and manufacturing in January of 1923. Strikes were called and resistance was encouraged. The strikes lasted 8 months. They damaged both the economy and society. I almost can't believe this next statement. In 1919, a loaf of bread cost 1 mark. By 1923, it was 100 billion marks. This country, now this is the Weimar Republic, continued to dispute their eastern borders. They wanted Austria to rejoin Germany. It had been a member of the German Confederation during the 19th century. From 1930 on, the president of the Weimar Republic, Paul von Hindenburg, realized that what he had to do was use emergency powers to back his chancellors, and he had a series of chancellors in the early 30s: Brüning, von Papen, and von Schleicher. So this is the Germany that Hitler got his meat hooks into. The Great Depression, which was exacerbated by their policies of deflation, led to a huge surge in unemployment. In 1923, Hitler enlisted von Ludendorff in a coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch. 16 Nazi members and 4 police officers were killed in that coup. Hitler was arrested. He spent a year in prison, 1 year, for a coup. It was during that year that he dictated Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess. That laid out his plans for transforming German society into one based on race. Jews were equated with germs. They were the poisoners of society, and the only solution was to exterminate them. He said this in 1923, and I think people didn't believe it. Germany at the time was administered by the Weimar Republic. Politics seemed to be settling down, the economy was improving, and no one was scared of Hitler. From there forward, his party started to grow. It engaged in electoral battles. Mostly their street battles and violence was between the Communist Party and the Nazis. Through the 20s and the early 30s, they gradually gained electoral support. The inflation raging, the depression deepened. He was a smart politician. He converted what was a party non-majority but plurality into governing power in the Weimar Republic in 1932. In 1933, remember I told you about the 3 chancellors that Hindenburg had, none of whom were successful. In January of 33, a new cabinet was sworn in. The the Nazi Party gained 3 posts. Hitler was named Chancellor, and Goering was named Minister of the Interior. As Chancellor, Hitler immediately started consolidating power, and he asked Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag. There would be elections the following March. In the meantime, the Reichstag building was set on fire. You've heard of the Reichstag fire? That's what that was. They blamed it on the communists. Most people think that the SA started the fire. In early 33, something called the Enabling Act was passed in the Reichstag. That gave the Chancellor power to enact laws without the Reichstag, basically overriding the aspects of the Weimar Constitution. Germany then withdrew from the League of Nations and also from the World Disarmament Conference. Now Hitler had control of the German government and he suppressed opposition. Next thing he did was he banned the Social Democrat Party. SA stormtroopers demolished union offices, trade unions were dissolved, and its leaders arrested. And then what he did was purge the SA. This is Ernst Röhm. He was the leader of the SA. By then, the SA was bigger than the any other organization in Germany. The night of the long knives, they were all arrested, put to death, and whatnot. By then, all opposition parties had been disbanded. Hindenburg died in 1934. The coup was over. Hitler was in charge. He was now commander-in-chief of the armed forces. When you took a loyalty oath in Germany, you took a loyalty oath to him personally, by name, in the army. In March of 35, he expanded the Wehrmacht to 600,000 members, which was 6 times the number permitted by the Versailles Treaty. It also included development of an air force and an increase in the size of the Navy. Now, I thought it would be interesting to get a perspective of what was happening to some people outside the government. And I picked this guy. This is a Jerry rat hole tour. Hugo Junckers. He was an aircraft engineer and designer. He pioneered the design of all metal airplanes and flying wings. His company was Junckers Aircraft. It was one of the mainstays of the German aircraft industry between the wars. Among the highlights of his career was the first successful heavier-than-air flight across the Atlantic. He also built this machine on the right called a flying wing. And the Ju-52 was one of the most famous airliners of the 30s. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they asked Juncker that his business aid in German rearmament. He declined. So what they said was, well, then we want all your patents and all your market shares. And if you don't agree with them, we're going to imprison you on grounds of high treason. He was placed under house arrest and he died at home. And my guess is he didn't die at home of natural causes during the negotiations to give up the stock and interest in his company. Under Nazi control, his company produced some of the most successful German warplanes of the Second World War. The Ju-87 is probably the one you've heard the most of, the dive bomber. But the Ju-88 was also a very successful twin-engine plane. Junckers was long gone. And that's what happened to people, influential people, who didn't agree with Adolf Hitler. In 1936, he signed something called an anti-Comintern pact with Japan. And I had to look up what that meant. But basically, in 1936, he signed a treaty with Japan against communism. Because remember, Japan also had to deal with Russia on their northwestern front. They signed this non-aggression pact with each other, and I think that's where eventually Hitler declared war on the United States. They also signed a non-aggression agreement with Mussolini. He sent supplies and assistance to the forces of Franco in the Spanish Civil War. Most people think that what that was doing was basic training. The Condor Legion was there, including aircraft and crews. There were also tank contingents. The Nationalists were victorious in 1939, and they became an ally of Nazi Germany, informally. In March of 1936, German forces entered the Rhineland, which this is the Rhineland. Supposedly, the Rhineland was to remain demilitarized from the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, German forces entered it. In 1938, he told the Austrian Chancellor that they needed to secure their frontiers. They gave him 1 day to hand over all power to the Austrian Nazi Party. They marched into Austria the next day. The Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia was the next target. Hitler demanded, and this is the Sudetenland. These are arenas around Czechoslovakia with sizable Germanic populations as opposed to Czechs and Slovaks. He wanted a plebiscite to determine if the population wanted to be a part of Germany. Neville Chamberlain famously said the Sudeten Germans' grievances were justified, and they advised Czechoslovakia to concede to the German demands. That month, next month, Czechoslovakia capitulated, and the rest of the country was soon occupied by the Germans, and Hitler now looked east. I'm going to run through the end of the 1,000-year Reich very fast. Next, Germany made a non-aggression pact with Russia. Remember, they had a non-aggression, or they had a pact with Japan. I don't know how Japan viewed this one with Russia. Germany and Russia both invaded Poland the following month. It soon fell, and France and England declared war on Germany. For a year, while France and England mobilized and then sat on it, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. In 1940, they overwhelmed the French, English, Belgian, and Dutch troops. In 1941, they invaded Russia, and they almost captured Moscow. At the same time, they also declared war on America, and I believe most people think that was a mistake. He should not have done that, because that brought us into the Second World War in Europe. In 1942 and 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad and El Alamein reflected the turn of the tide. The Allies captured North Africa and invaded Italy the same year. In 1944, the Allied forces invaded Normandy and headed towards the German heartland. In 1945, the Russians captured Berlin. Hitler committed suicide, and the 1,000-year Reich was over. Now, America's current unrest. As I did the work on digging up what was some of the more details about this, I was really surprised. America's story is one long history of protests and riots. The first one was Shay's rebellion, the one I talked about earlier. That fueled the need to get out of the Articles of Confederation and get into the Constitution. From that one, free rioters were hanged. In our history, there have been more than 750 specifically listed riots in our history. Most of them have been race riots. Now, here's one that wasn't. The Homestead Steel Riots in 1892 killed 15 steel workers, but that was followed by an East St. Louis massacre in 1917, where race and labor-related violence resulted in anywhere from 50 to 150 deaths. And if you want to read a sad story, read about the East St. Louis massacre. In 1967 alone, there were 160 race riots across the country with almost 100 deaths. including the Detroit riot where regular army troops had to be brought in. In '68, the next year, there were another 100 race-related riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and 45 more people died. In 1992, the Rodney King riots resulted in 65 deaths in Los Angeles and in other cities. The Minneapolis riots, which have followed the death of George Floyd, have led to 30 deaths thus far. Major cities, and I just picked these 5, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, Kansas City, and St. Louis, are in siege mentality. Federal forces are being used to supplement local and state gendarmes. Portland has had 2 solid months of daily protests, violence, and arson, and there's no end in sight in Portland. So the current unrest, what is it about the current unrest that bothers me? I think it's different. It seems to have no end. Portland's in their 3rd month. Multiple governors have been coming to these street protests. Many mayors are reluctant to reestablish law and order. They seem to include a wide spectrum of age, race, and I mean race. A number of the protests and riots that I've looked at have been more white than black, and gender participants. An awful lot of women are participating. The Black Lives Matter movement has little focus beyond destabilizing the current system, the police forces, and monuments and memorials. And I just read something today about what's going on in Minneapolis. They have agreed to develop a start from scratch new system in Minneapolis. What they're going to do with the existing system, I don't know. The pandemic seems to be fueling the unrest. It also is getting worse as the unrest continues. The mass media, from my perspective anyway, is sensationalizing everything, and they seem so biased as to be completely non-constructive. Federal and state governments are not working off the same sheet of music. They are at loggerheads. They may make some level of agreements like they finally did it in Oregon, but I don't know that that's even representative of where they are with other states. Congress and the executive branch of the government don't seem to be able to agree with much of anything either. So that's my perception of the current unrest. Conclusions. This is not the first or even the 100th time that this kind of racial unrest has occurred in America. But race riots can translate into race wars. And from my perspective, and I'm probably an alarmist, the crossover time isn't too far away. On August the 15th, there's going to be, or certainly is on the schedule, a confrontation between that black movement of heavily armed, I forget what their euphemism is, but they all have AR-15s and they all look like they want trouble. And white supremacists are going to meet at Stone Mountain on the 15th. I have no idea how anybody keeps trouble from that. Even though we're frightened, polarizing is not likely to be helpful. If we can't rely on our legally constituted agencies to resolve this issue, they're going to spin out of control. If history is any indicator, we're approaching a fork in the road. We either find cultural reconciliation or we go to martial law. 3 of the 4 I discussed took option 2. That's it. Anybody still there?
Yeah. Yeah, we're here.
Somebody answer the phone.
That's Trump calling in to argue with George.
Yeah.
Well, what do you say, guys?
Well, that's a good report. I think, George, I see a couple things that are quite different. If you look at some of I'll call it, if you want to call a revolution successful, one of the things that happened was the leadership was coordinated, um, in a meaningful way. And now that the leadership was actually involved. Now, what we've got going on right now is just rabble in the streets. I don't see any kind of coordination there at all. I do think a lot of this is being funded from outside. I think there are foreign countries doing this. It's rumored that George Soros does this. I think they like to pick on him. I think he is a bastard, but nonetheless, I don't know how effective he is. How do you get your money from George Soros to somebody that makes a difference? That's a question. I think what you were talking about there at one point was the Antifa movement. Is that who's going to Stone Mountain? Is that?
No.
Who is it?
The black group is someone called I Don't Give a Fuck.
Oh.
Well,
they got to improve their public relations. I don't know who they are. So.
You haven't seen any of that, John?
I saw some of it.
There's about 100 and some odd of them. They all have AR-15s or AK-47s, and they are chanting all sorts of fairly hostile. If Whitey does this, kill him.
Have they actually done anything thus far?
They got in trouble in Louisville. I don't know what happened. Three people got hurt. They did not have, at least I don't think they ran into the white supremacists. White supremacists are the one holding the meeting the 15th, Stone Mountain. And if they aren't there, I'm missing that. I'll be real surprised if they aren't there.
Yeah, I think the federal government is already inserted agents in those organizations to monitor and get ready to move pretty quickly if there is a coalescence of these forces. I can't imagine just sitting back and letting them march in there and shoot each other. It might happen, but I don't have that. I don't have that fear.
I got a topic for you for next week. Why don't you go back
next week? That's you.
You go back and compare the 1968-69 turmoil that everybody thought the world, the country was going to end. How they corrupted the anti-war movement.
Yep.
Into a revolution by the Weathermen and other things. And those were all young white college kids, and
riots weren't.
You had the Black Panthers in there involved, but much of the Weathermen and that group were all white college kids, college professors, and such.
I think that would be a very, very interesting topic to get into. I was at Fort Jackson in '68 when they were sending troops all over the country, and we really anticipated a lot more trouble than actually happened. But you're right, that was worse. There's no doubt about it, Jerry. And I think Bill is right too. So far, I haven't seen this kind of focus of leadership that says all this nonsense has any place to go, other than destabilize. But at what point in time do the governments clamp down?
Don't forget, '68 occurred right before an election too, and I think give it 6 months after the election, things will quiet down.
Okay, you might be right.
Hey, Bill.
I don't know if it'll quiet down, Jerry.
This is very hard to discuss without discussing politics.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, just want to let you know, Elvin York, he had a series of strokes, and he was confined to his bed from 1954 until he died in 1964, and he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. at the age of 76. And
Yeah. Well, we
Just-
saw his house, you know, saw
Yeah.
his bed, all of his stuff when we went up there. So
but he was over 250 pounds at the time he was
Yeah.
died.
and he was a big guy. I mean, he was like 6,
Yeah.
3 or something. I mean, he
Right.
wasn't some little old, skinny guy like you maybe think about in that time area when.
I bet he was at least even, easily 100 pounds heavier than when he was at his fighting weight during World
Yeah.
War One.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm sorry.
100 pounds?
Yeah, I bet he was about
I
100.
bet he was too. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway.
Well,
Anyway, good program, George. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, George.
Thanks, George.
We'll
Yeah,
try to
good
figure
program.
out what's going on
Thanks,
next
George.
week.
Yeah, thanks, George. That was good. A lot of information.
Well, I tried to overwhelm you with data.
I'm gonna stop the recording.
All right.
All right.